One of the most horror-filled, nightmarish nights of murder in the recorded annals of American crime.
Sharon Tate.
Sharon Tate has dead.
Heavily pregnant, she and 4 of her friends were brutally murdered by the so-called Charles Manson family.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski.
A wandering band of members of a so-called religious cult with a leader they call Jesus has had 3 of its followers arrested in the investigation of the murder of Sharon Tate and 6 others.
I mean, it's nightmarish. It's nightmarish. He could get them to murder whomever he asked them to murder. Their religion, their credo was to kill as many people as they could.
Is there anything you think you can pass on that society really is missing and that you can tell them about?
Society knows when it wants to know. There's just a jellyfish, and it's only controlled by the people who want to move the sheep around. They'll tell them anything. Everybody knows that everybody's lying.
This podcast is about how we know with 99% certainty that Charles Manson and his followers were weapons created by the CIA's notorious and illegal mind control experiments known as MKUltra. And I think you're going to conclude that we know this with 100% certainty by the time you hear all the evidence that I lay out here. This secret and illegal program was launched by the CIA in 1953 and halted in 1973 when the U.S. Senate started investigating this program, an investigation led by Senator Frank Church from Idaho. You will also learn here that there is a solid connection between Charles Manson's mass murders and the assassinations of both President John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy. And these same forces in the CIA are still at work today, and probably even more intensely. The CIA was an evil organization in the 1960s, and it's just as evil today, if not more so. Now, I used to be a big fan of the CIA. I believed the propaganda that the CIA and the intelligence agencies were the good guys. I grew up loving James Bond movies, even thought about joining the CIA myself upon graduating from Dartmouth College. I spoke with CIA recruiters. I used to think the CIA was doing mostly good work to protect the country from foreign enemies. I was wrong. The CIA sees its primary mission as the control of the American people, including the outcome of our elections. Anything that the CIA sees outside of its control, the CIA doesn't like. Now, the CIA used to be more right-leaning and anti-communist. Today, the CIA is more left-leaning.
I refuse to internalize misguided patriarchal ideas.
It's important to belong to an agency resource group.
Inclusion is a core value here.
It also creates a safe place.
But whether more right-leaning in the 1950s and 1960s, or more left-leaning today, the CIA is and has always been primarily motivated by control of the American people. So buckle up for an insane ride. Now, much of the material in this podcast is taken from a great book by Tom O'Neill called Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 1960s. And this is a big book. It's about 522 pages. It has like 63 pages of footnotes. Tom O'Neill is a prize-winning investigative journalist, very well respected. And Tom O'Neill worked on this book for more than 20 years, filing Freedom of Information Act requests to get the files on the case. He conducted hundreds of hours of interviews with the key figures. Now, this book has not gotten the attention it deserves because, well, it blows apart the narrative created by the prosecution, led by Los Angeles District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi, which Bugliosi also writes up in his book Helter, Skelter. And Bugliosi's book Helter, Skelter was pretty much the popularly accepted narrative. But O'Neill's book presents a mountain of evidence that Charles Manson and his cult of followers were the products of the CIA's notorious MKUltra mind control experiments. And this was fascinating to me because it fits into my overall theme of the last maybe 8 years or so of the CIA being a truly malevolent and very dangerous organization. And the FBI and Department of Justice have become equally dangerous and malevolent. And they all work together as part of the same cabal. I also put together a video here on how the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, was indeed a product of the CIA's MKUltra mind control experiments. And we know that from this book here by Dr. Alston Chase. Ted Kaczynski, who became the Unabomber, was a human guinea pig for the CIA's MKUltra mind control experiments for 3 years when he was a student at Harvard. Now, Ted Kaczynski was a brilliant mathematician with a measured IQ of 167. And for context, Albert Einstein had an IQ of 160. Ted Kaczynski's was 167. He skipped 2 grades in school and entered Harvard with a full scholarship at the age of 16. And he had a tremendous career ahead of him as the youngest ever assistant professor in mathematics at the University of California at Berkeley. But sadly, Kaczynski allowed himself to be subjected to 3 years of mind control experiments by the CIA's MKUltra mind control program when he was a student at Harvard. The CIA's MKUltra mind control experiments included the use of LSD on its subjects in combination with amphetamines and other drugs, plus hypnosis, brainwashing, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, electroshock on the brain, and long periods of abusive interrogation. As a kid from Lombard, Illinois, and from a working-class background, Ted Kaczynski needed the money. So he agreed to take part in MKUltra while a student at Harvard, and quite likely in exchange for his full scholarship to Harvard when he was 16 years old. Now, what exactly was the CIA's MKUltra mind control program? Well, MKUltra tried to create brainwashed human weapons that could be controlled through drugs, hypnosis, extended periods of brainwashing, and mind control techniques. And the easiest way to visualize this is to watch the classic 1962 movie, The Manchurian Candidate. And this is a great movie, by the way, well worth seeing if you haven't seen it. In this movie, American soldier Robert Shaw was captured during the Korean War, and he was taken to communist China. He was brainwashed during captivity by the communist Chinese to become a sleeper agent in the United States, a human weapon when he returned to the United States.
Captain Marco, you be good enough to lend Raymond your pistol, please. Shoot Bobby, Raymond.
And the triggering mechanism for him to carry out his assignments was to be shown the Queen of Diamonds. And this would trigger Robert Shaw to carry out whatever assignment was given to him. And then Shaw would immediately forget what he had done after he had completed the task. And Robert Shaw's ultimate assignment was to assassinate the leading candidate for President of the United States. The CIA's MKUltra program was launched in 1953 with the goal of creating brainwashed human weapons similar to what we see in the Manchurian Candidate movie. Now we've had 2 assassination attempts against Donald Trump. Were these 2 would-be assassins also products of the CIA? I don't know, but they have all the hallmarks, and we'll get into this later. And this MKUltra mind control program first came to public light in 1975 as a result of the Senate committee investigation led by Democrat Senator Frank Church, known as the Church Committee hearings. The files on MKUltra were ordered destroyed by CIA Director Richard Helms in 1973, but some files were discovered nevertheless. Now the CIA is supposed to be protecting America from foreign enemies. The CIA is prohibited by its charter and by law from targeting the American people. But that's what MKUltra was doing. And the CIA continues to do this today, illegally. In his 522-page book, with 63 pages of footnotes or endnotes, Tom O'Neill presents a mountain of evidence that Charles Manson and his followers were creations of the CIA's MKUltra program. Now, I really can't do justice to all the evidence that Tom O'Neill presents here in his book because I'd be here talking to you for about 12 hours or longer. But I'll try to hit the high points. Ever since Charles Manson and his followers launched their 2-night home invasion murder spree in August of 1969, killing 9 people over the course of 2 nights, I've been fascinated by Charles Manson. I remember the news accounts vividly, and I've read all the important books on Manson, and became something of an expert on Charles Manson when I was a teenager. I'm not going to go into much detail here on the murders and the trial, except as needed to present a coherent story. The murders and trials are all covered in great detail in many books and documentaries. The two most famous being the book Helter, Skelter by the prosecutor, the LA District Attorney, Vince Bugliosi, and another great book here called The Family, titled The Family by Ed Sanders. This is another big book. Bugliosi's book, Helter Skelter, reads more like a legal brief. It's more just the prosecution's case, whereas this book by Sanders goes into just a lot of detail about Manson's life and what it was like to be a member of Manson's group, his family of followers, the Manson family. And here was life in the Manson family in 1968 on the Spahn Ranch, 25 miles northwest of Los Angeles.
Who is the one? Is I'm looking for the last door. And you are the one.
This is a song by Charles Manson called Ride Away. It's a really good song. The guitar player here is Manson family member and future killer Clem Grogan, who was involved in the LaBianca murders and the murder of Spahn Ranch hand Donald Shorty Shea on August 26, 1969, 3 weeks after the Tate LaBianca home invasion murders. Manson had Shorty killed because Manson believed that Shorty had reported the family to the police for their crimes.
Except through the music. How else do you think I can stop looking? Just follow the sound. Push to the ground, and the wind has lost its sound. The ocean's empty, and the world is turning upside down. It's turning upside down. It's upside down. It's It's upside down. It's turning. Yea, though you walk through the valley of death, I'll be beside you. Where my way. The world is my playground, so come on, ride. Come on away, man. My way. The world is my playground, so come on, ride.
The music and vibes are good here at this point. I can see why the kids loved it here. And I can see why these kids were drawn to Charlie Manson. But here's a quick summary of the events that just shocked the nation and really ended the 1960s, ended the LSD-laced hippie movement and the anti-war protests for the most part. First, the Sharon Tate murders, which totaled 5 victims. 6 victims if you count her unborn son, Paul. Sharon Tate was 8.5 months pregnant. Sharon Tate was a famous and beautiful 26-year-old actress at the time of her murder, her most memorable movie being The Valley of the Dolls. She was also the wife of the famed film director Roman Polanski, who was on a trip and so wasn't there that night. Roman Polanski is also accused of raping a 10-year-old girl and other children. So he lives in exile and would be arrested if he returned to the United States. But that's not the topic of this video. Other victims at the Tate Polanski house that night were Abigail Folger, the 25-year-old heiress to the Folger coffee fortune. Another victim was screenwriter and actor Wojciech Frykowski, also a celebrity hairstylist named Jay Sebring, and 18-year-old Stephen Parent. Now, Charles Manson was not in attendance for this slaughter, but he ordered it, or so says the prosecution, and I think he probably did. And Manson knew the house because he had a relationship with the Beach Boys record producer Terry Melcher, who had promised Charlie a record deal. Melcher had been the previous tenant of that house. The Polanski Tate house was a center of social activity for the Hollywood glitterati. Manson ordered his followers to invade the house and kill everyone in it, in as gruesome a way as possible. Manson's top henchman was Tex Watson. He went in armed with a pistol. The women had knives. On his way onto the property, Tex Watson shot and killed 18-year-old Stephen Parent, who was in his car in the driveway. Parent was visiting a friend in the guest house on the property. Stephen Parent just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Stephen Parent was a witness, so he had to go. So Tex Watson bludgeoned and stabbed Stephen Parent multiple times and then shot him 4 times. Watson was big and athletic, 6'2", and he had been captain of his high school football team in Texas. Tex Watson was Charles Manson's enforcer. Watson and two of the girls entered through the house by cutting a screen in an open window, the two girls being Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel. A third woman, Linda Kasabian, waited outside as a lookout. Tex Watson assembled the victims in the living room at gunpoint. Watson began tying Sharon Tate and Sebring together by their necks with a rope. He threw the rope over a ceiling beam. He was apparently going to hang them. Sebring struggled to get away, so Watson shot him and stabbed him 7 times. Abigail Folger fled to the bedroom. She was tracked down by Patricia Krenwinkel. Abigail offered Krenwinkel what cash she had in her wallet. She managed to free herself from Krenwinkel and run out the bedroom door to the outside. But Krenwinkel ran her down, tackled Abigail near the swimming pool, and started stabbing her. Tex Watson then came out to finish the job. Abigail was stabbed 28 times. Meanwhile, Wojak Frykowski managed to free himself while Susan Atkins was keeping watch. She started stabbing him. He managed to crawl out the front door despite many stab wounds from Atkins. Watson caught up with him on the front porch, beat him on the head with his gun, shot him twice, and stabbed him many times. And finally, Sharon Tate was stabbed 16 times by Susan Atkins and probably Tex Watson. Susan Atkins then wrote "Pig" on the front door with Sharon Tate's blood. Charlie thought they had screwed up the slaughter because they had entered the house with inadequate weaponry. Tex only had a pistol, the girls' knives, and they had not written the correct messages on the walls with the blood of the victims. So Charlie would go along on the next slaughter, which would be the following night, to show them how to do it correctly. The next night included 4 killers from the previous night, plus Charles Manson, Leslie Van Houten, and Clem Grogan. They arrived at the home of grocery store executive Lino LaBianca and his wife, Rosemary LaBianca. According to Watson's testimony, Lino was sleeping on the sofa. Manson woke him up at gunpoint. Rosemary LaBianca was awakened in the bedroom by Watson and brought into the living room, and the couple was tied up. Pillowcases were put over their heads. Manson then left the house, with Atkins, Kasabian, and Grogan. Watson, Van Houten, and Krenwinkel stayed to finish the job. Leslie Van Houten stabbed Rosemary LaBianca 16 times. Patricia Krenwinkel stabbed Lino 14 times and left a steak knife in his throat. And Tex Watson delivered multiple stabbings with a bayonet. In all, the couple was stabbed 41 times. Using the blood of the victims, Krenwinkel wrote "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the walls, and the phrase "Helter, Skelter" on the refrigerator door. Manson wanted to make the slaughters look like the work of the Black Panthers. His idea was to trigger a race war between blacks and whites. At least that was the prosecution's theory of the case.
Well, this was a definition of Helter Skelter that Charlie gave. Now, if you look at this White album, it's a Beatles album. There are many other songs. One of them is called Sexy Sadie. Sadie Glutz, also known as Susan Atkins, whatever you want to call her, she thought that the Beatles named this song after her. There's also a song called Piggies. There's also a song...
What is it in the Helter Skelter song?
Nothing particularly in that song right there, except the definition that Manson gave of it. There's another song in that same album called Blackbirds, talking about blackbirds fixing their wings and rising up. Charles Manson said the blackbird meant the black man. To ignite Helter Skelter, to start the black-white revolution, Manson envisioned that white people would turn against the black man if they thought the black man had committed these 7 murders, and ultimately there would be a civil war between blacks and whites out on the street. Manson told his followers that this would be a bloodbath in the streets of every American city. Manson foresaw that the black man would win this war. But later on, he said the black man, because of inexperience, would simply not be able to handle the reins of power. So we would have to look around at those white people who had survived, who had escaped from Helter Skelter. In other words, turn over the reins of power to Charles Manson and his family.
What does Helter Skelter mean?
Well, where does it come from? To Charles Manson, Helter Skelter means the black man rising up against the white establishment and murdering the entire white race. That is, with the exception of Charlie and his family, who intended to escape to the desert and live in the bottomless pit, a place that he got from Revelation 9, which is the last book of the New Testament.
And why did the murders take place?
He envisioned that he and his family would be the ultimate beneficiaries of a black-white civil war.
Why the LaBiancas and the persons in the Tate house? Why were they selected by Manson as victims?
Well, you have to realize that if you're going to have a bizarre motive like this, it doesn't really make any difference who the victims are. except the victims by necessity had to be white and preferably in the white establishment. But other than that, there was no particular reason.
Do the girls really believe he's Jesus Christ reincarnated?
There is evidence that they actually believe that Charles Manson is Jesus Christ.
Now, obviously, this entire vision was insane, but Manson's followers believed it, and they saw Charlie as their Messiah. We don't actually know what Charlie believed. He was too intelligent probably to really believe any of this nonsense.
But as far as lining up someone for some kind of helter-skelter trip, you know, that's the district attorney's motive. That's the only thing he could find for a motive to throw up on top of all that confusion he had. There was no such thing in my mind as helter-skelter. Helter-skelter was a song, and it was a nightclub. We opened up a little after-hours nightclub to make some money and play some music and do some dancing and singing and play some stuff to make some money for doom buggies to go out in the desert. And we called the club Helter Skelter. It was a Helter Skelter club because we would be there, and when the cops would come, we'd all melt into other dimensions because it wasn't licensed to be anything in particular. And it was kind of like a speakeasy back in the moonshine days behind the movie set.
The book Helter Skelter.
Right.
You said that there are a lot of things wrong with it. What's wrong with it?
Well, the book's all right. Got good paper and all in it. All this paper comes from trees. It's a shame to waste all your trees writing this trash for your children to be raised up in. Do you want your children to live according to the gospel of Helter Skelter?
Where are the inaccuracies in it?
Well, it would take me as long as it took him to point them out. It took him 2 years in court to invent them. It would take me 2 years in court to uninvent them and redo them and show the proper perspective of it.
Bulliosi.
Yeah. Helter Skelter simply means confusion. And if you don't see the confusion in the world, there's always been confusion in the world, then I guess you don't know what confusion means.
Did they make up the evidence introduced in court?
A big percentage of it they found and created themselves. And I wasn't even there. All we wanted to do to start with was tell the truth, but the lawyers wouldn't let us because they wanted to sell it. We just wanted to tell the truth, but they didn't want the truth to come out because you couldn't write books with the truth, couldn't make big money, couldn't sell all this madness, all the fear and the vicarious thrill for somebody.
Charlie, regardless of Helter Skelter, do you belong behind bars?
There's no behind bars.
Do you belong in prison?
There's no prison. It's only in your mind. If everybody agrees to let me go, then I'll walk out, and then I'll be free. And my chains are in everybody's mind. It's in their will. If you will me to be locked up, then I must stay locked up. If you will me to be free, then I'll be free. It's not as complicated to me as it is to you. You look at it through the books and the paperwork. I don't look at it that way. I look at it from the way I look at it. So I'll ask you the same question. Do you think you deserve to be locked up somewhere?
I'm asking the questions in the interview. Can I do it?
Well, certainly, but you have to ask yourself the same time.
I realize that.
You know, if justice came, where would we all be? We'd all be in some sort of trouble, wouldn't we? That's why we have Jesus. See, he takes up the slack. Linda Kasabian, for example, she'd only been at the ranch a couple weeks. I'd seen her maybe twice. You know, like I never paid that much attention to the people that came and went at that ranch. They just came and went as they chose.
So you're saying he's took a few pieces of truth?
And messed it with his ability to play with words in colleges and books and things, and he wanted to impress someone with all the things he's learned, and he wanted some attention, and he wanted to be all the things in the movies, you know, so he played his part. And I wasn't allowed to play my part. I was only allowed to sit down and be the figure that was dragged off into the hole all the time, because he had the money behind him, because he said he had the people behind him. But that's another thing that's wrong with your court system. Your court system's not based on the will of the people, it's based on the will of the money. So your courts are not really protecting anything but the money. It doesn't have much concern for the people anymore.
I've got a curiosity. Can I ask you a question? Remember you had an X years ago and you changed it now to a swastika?
No, I never changed. It's been the same thing all the way along.
Wasn't it always an X?
No, it never was.
What's it stand for?
It stands for whatever I mean it to stand for, and whatever I make it stand for, and whatever I want it to stand for.
But you didn't one time say you were Xing yourself out?
No, that was your newspapers that gave you that.
What does it stand for you?
It stands for many things. And it would take 2 or 3 weeks to explain all the things that I've built.
Can you give me an example?
In the image. Certainly, I can give you an example of the United States flag of America.
The swastika?
The rising sun in the Japanese flag. The Star of David to the Israelis. Whatever country or nation or people or cause has always had a symbol.
And that's your symbol?
That's mine. I put that there from 2 or 3 other symbols. I didn't want to put a Christian symbol, and I didn't want to put an Antichrist symbol, and I didn't want to put a pro-communism, and I didn't want to put an anti-thermoflacaflop and all that kind of stuff that you play.
But it is a swastika. That would be Germany, wouldn't it?
No, that's not a Nazi. Hitler got that sign from mysticism and reversed it. He did the same thing, only he did it backwards. You know, it's the thought still here, just like the thought that he picked up was there when he picked it up. The thought has always been here. Since the pyramids have been here, since David and the giant, since the whole thing's always been here. And every once in a while there's a guy like Gandhi that comes and picks it up. Or there's a guy like Maharasha Yogananda, or somebody coming out of some prison, or somebody doing something, and they pick it up for a while and they carry it for a few steps, and then when they're gone you say, oh, what a good guy he was. But while he's here, he's always just no good at all, you know.
Manson's IQ in prison was measured at 121, even though he was almost illiterate because he never attended school. But Manson's followers definitely believed in the Helter Skelter vision laid out by Charlie, and he had total mind control over his followers. It's believed that Manson and his family of followers committed at least 24 murders, and some believe 35 murders. They were convicted of 9 murders. But one aspect of the Manson murders is that their savagery bore no resemblance to the histories of the people involved in these murders. Now, true, Charlie had an extensive criminal background. Charles Manson was born to a 16-year-old runaway named Kathleen Maddox in Cincinnati, Ohio. He never met his father. Charlie adopted the last name Manson after one of his mom's boyfriends. His mom was a substance abuser and an alcoholic, and was convicted of armed robbery. She was given a 10-year prison sentence. She served 5 years of that. Charlie lived for a while with his uncle, but it was too much for him, and he was bounced around to assorted foster care homes. But he was always in trouble. Charlie's first stint in juvenile detention was at the age of 9, for setting fire to his school. For a time, Charlie did try to hold down a steady job as a teen delivering messages for Western Union, but he continued to supplement his income with burglaries, and he was caught. A sympathetic judge sent Manson to Boys Town in Nebraska when Charlie was 13, but after just 4 days there, Manson and a friend escaped. They stole a car, obtained a gun, and committed 2 armed robberies. Manson was arrested 2 weeks later. He was linked also to 2 other robberies. So young Manson was then sent to a very rough reform school in Terre Haute, Indiana, that was run by Catholic priests, called Jabalt School for Boys. And discipline included brutal beatings by the staff. Now Manson was short. He was 5'2", even as an adult. And at this reform school in Indiana, Manson was repeatedly beaten and raped with the encouragement of a staff member. Manson escaped from this reform school 18 times. While at this reform school, Manson developed a self-defense technique that he called the insane game, where he would scream, yell, and flail his arms wildly and pretend that he was insane. And this seemed to work pretty well. Manson finally escaped the Indiana facility with 2 other boys in February of 1951. They robbed gas stations while driving stolen cars and headed to California, but they were arrested in Utah. Manson was placed in the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C., in the federal system. The psychiatrist assessed Manson as aggressively antisocial. After a short time there, in 1951, Manson was transferred to the Natural Bridge Honor Camp in Petersburg, Virginia. And he was visited there by his aunt. She told officials he could stay at her house and she would help him find a job. Manson was 16 years old by this point. The problem was that 2 weeks before young Charlie's parole hearing, 16-year-old Manson sodomized another boy at knife point. And this was Charlie's most violent act prior to the murders of 1969 that we know about. And he was still pretty much a kid then, age 16. Manson was then transferred to an even tougher reform camp for youth called the Federal Reformatory, also in Petersburg, Virginia. So Charlie was far from a model citizen as a Ute. But as an adult, the prison system classified Charlie Manson as nonviolent. And even Manson's prosecutor, LA District Attorney Vince Bugliosi, wrote that Manson had no sustained history of violence. Let's listen to Manson describe his youth at a 1992 parole hearing.
Do I get a minute here in between there?
What do you want a minute?
To respond to just what that record that you laid out there?
We'll go back to that.
There's no way my mind can handle that. In other words, I don't have the papers you have, and I can't refer to what you're referring to.
Yes, you may respond to this right now.
Okay.
Right, go ahead.
What that whole first 11 years being locked up in was trying to get away. You got a juvenile, you lock him up in juvenile hall, he don't know anything. He's got no parents. He's got nobody telling him the truth. Everybody's lying to him. So the only thing he can do is run away. So that's all I did. I ran away. And every time I ran away, they just got me and put me in a harder place to get away. So every time I would run away, they would take me and put me in a more difficult place to run away until I got to the federal prison system. I ran through Indiana, and I ran through Illinois, and I ran through Ohio. And then when they put me in Washington, D.C., Dr. Hartman put me in Virginia, Natural Bridge Camp with the moon, and that was in 1951. Then I went to Petersburg, Camp Petersburg, Virginia, where they got the military academy. And then I went to Pennsylvania. And then I went to Ohio. And in 1954, I got out. And I really didn't know what I was doing. I was still 9 years old in third grade in my mind. I couldn't very well know what was going on. You know, I never had any help from anyone. No one ever done anything for me. So what I did was I married the first girl I came to and stole a car and came to California because that's where she wanted to come. And I just followed her around like a blind guy because I really didn't know California was, I didn't know what California was. I'm a dumb hillbilly. I thought the pigeons were seagulls and the seagulls were pigeons. I didn't know the difference, So when I got to California, it was all about fighting in the county jail. I wasn't out on the street but maybe 2 or 3 weeks before they had me in the jail back in Terminal Island. So I went through the lieutenant there, and they brought the guys, the lieutenants and the men that were in the uniforms from the dentist office and all the Navy and the doctors from Dr. Hartman. They brought them from back east. They brought them to Terminal Island with a lot of the old-time gangsters that were being released as going to Needles, California, and out in the deserts and doing different things in the mafia world and that old underworld where they made all the moonshine and stuff. So I learned all the things they learned. So I'm picking up all these things from all these older men. So they're laying out to me what's right and what's wrong. And I don't really know what's right and what's wrong because people that say what's right and wrong, they're not doing what they say. They're doing something different than what they say, So I had to find all this out for myself. So then when you keep calling me a criminal and keep calling me a bad guy because I don't have no parents, because I don't have no money, because I don't have no education. You got to have education or some parents or you're not smart. You got to be stupid if you don't read and write. You got to be all the things that are bad if you ain't got nobody to protect you, because you find out in that cell the only person that loves you is Jesus Christ. And that rebirth movement in 1967 was mine. Now you can tell Carter and all them other people that's been stealing my life every day and living in my reality, that they could read Corinthians 13 chapter verse, and that'll handle that part of it. That's the end of what I got to say there.
You did a good job there.
Basically, Manson did what he needed to do to survive. He did not like to engage in physical confrontations. He's only 5'2", so he tried to avoid physical conflict. Aside from the constant burglaries and car theft, another reason Manson spent so much time in prison is he just wouldn't follow the rules of his probations and his parole. He just wouldn't stick around the jurisdiction as is required of parolees unless they get permission. So he was constantly being sent back to prison. Charlie just wasn't a rule follower. But for the most part, he was thought to be nonviolent until the summer of 1969. And even then, he wasn't physically present at the murders. Susan Atkins was the only Manson follower who had a criminal record before meeting Manson. When she was 18, she was working as a stripper in Los Angeles. And Atkins was arrested with 2 felons in a stolen car. The 2 felons had been committing a string of armed robberies of gas stations, and Atkins was the driver. She was ultimately convicted of possession of stolen goods and carrying a concealed weapon. She was put on 3 years probation. But even Atkins grew up in a middle-class home, middle-class family near San Jose, California. She sung in the church choir. And when her mom was dying of cancer, Atkins arranged for the church choir to sing Christmas carols outside Atkins' mom's bedroom window. Atkins was living with some friends in kind of a group house in LA when she was working as a stripper. And she met Manson in 1967 when she came home one night and found Manson in the living room playing the guitar with her roommates listening. And like others, she fell under Manson's spell. Manson invited her to go on a road trip in a converted school bus that they had painted black. And that was it. Atkins was then in the Manson family. Patricia Krenwinkel also grew up in a middle-class family in Los Angeles. She taught Sunday school, was thinking about becoming a nun. She attended a Jesuit college called Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama. Leslie Van Houten was from a church-going family in a suburb of L.A. and was the homecoming princess at her high school. She ran away from home to become a hippie. She lived for a while in a hippie commune in Northern California where she met Bobby Beausoleil, who would become one of Manson's future killers. Beausoleil would later take part in the torture and killing of Gary Hinman on July 31st, 1969, shortly before the Tate LaBianca murders. Hinman was killed over money and property that Manson said Hinman owed the family. And Hinman was tortured for 3 days prior to being stabbed to death multiple times. Susan Atkins and Mary Brunner were present at the killing. And Tex Watson, the worst of the Manson family in terms of sheer violence, was a model citizen until he hooked up with Charlie. Watson was a high school football star in Texas. He was captain of his football team. He set a high school record for the high hurdles. He was the editor of the school newspaper. He attended church every Sunday. Watson grew up in a good Christian family. He attended the University of North Texas, where he was a fraternity member. And Watson would often travel to Los Angeles to visit a fraternity brother friend. And after one of his trips to California, he announced to his parents that he was moving to California. And here's how Watson met Manson. One day in the spring of 1968, he picked up a hitchhiker who happened to be Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. He was the drummer for the legendary Beach Boys band. Pretty odd. Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys was hitchhiking for some reason. But actually, hitchhiking was very common in those days. I hitchhiked all the time as a teenager throughout the 1970s. It was common back then. Dennis Wilson invited Tex Watson to his mansion. And when Tex arrived, Charlie Manson was there, along with many of Manson's followers. Manson and his followers had moved in with Wilson and were living there. And it was a never-ending party at Dennis Wilson's house. I'll get back to Charlie's relationship with Dennis Wilson and the Beach Boys in a bit because that story is fascinating. But a key point to hold in mind is that other than Susan Atkins and Manson himself, all of Manson's key followers had no history of violence or serious criminal activity prior to joining Manson. They were all runaways from middle-class families. They had good backgrounds. They just wanted to become hippies. And when these kids arrived in Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, they were there for the vibes, the love, the music, the LSD, the weed, and the endless party. So how did these kids become crazed zombie-like killers who would kill in the most savage and bloodthirsty way imaginable at Charlie's command? Yes, Charlie was a charismatic and captivating character, but that really doesn't explain it. In March of 1967, Charlie was released from McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary in Washington State. He had served 7 years of a 10-year prison sentence for trying to pass a stolen $43 tax refund check. An extraordinary amount of time for such an offense. A $43 forged check. 7 years in a federal penitentiary for that. And I suspect that Charlie was selected here at McNeil Island at the McNeil Island Federal Prison for the CIA's MKUltra mind control experiments. Manson was the perfect candidate for MKUltra. He had no family who would miss him. Manson was ordered to move to Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco as a condition of his parole. And the government gave him a pretty nice apartment at 636 Cole Street. Here it is. And Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Mary Brunner would later move into that apartment with Manson when he began assembling his followers. And Manson's apartment, and this is key, was just 2 blocks away from the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, where Manson and the girls were a near constant presence. The Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic was funded by the National Institute for Mental Health, which also funded the CIA's MKUltra mind control experiments. Charlie Manson's parole officer was named Roger Smith. Roger Smith had been a federal parole officer, but he became a parole officer in San Francisco County, so he could earn his PhD in criminology with an emphasis on psychiatry at the University of California at Berkeley. And when Roger Smith was not doing his job as a parole officer, he was working at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. Now, normally a San Francisco parole officer has anywhere from 100 to 250 cases that they have to oversee, parolees that they have to meet with regularly and track and monitor. Now, some might have as few as 40 if they're handling especially intensive cases. And that was true for Roger Smith for a while. But Roger Smith ended up with just one case, one felon in his portfolio, that being Charles Manson. Roger Smith's ostensible full-time job was as a parole officer, so his full-time job was overseeing Charles Manson, even though Charles Manson at this point was just a low-level criminal. Manson had just spent 7 years at McNeil Island Penitentiary for trying to pass a stolen $43 check. How can a full-time parole officer have just one parolee with a low-level criminal record to keep track of? But that was the case for Roger Smith, who spent most of his time at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, even though he was being paid as a full-time parole officer. And Roger Smith would almost always see Manson at the clinic, not at his parole officer office. And Charlie would almost always bring his women with him, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Brunner. And Tom O'Neill also discovered that Roger Smith's work with Charlie Manson was also funded by the National Institute for Mental Health as part of what was called the San Francisco Project. This was an experimental project that involved rehabilitation therapies and treatments for newly released felons. And there were at least 6 other parole officers known to be affiliated with this San Francisco project. Now, the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic was set up by a man named Dr. David E. Smith, no relation to Roger Smith. He set up the clinic in the spring of 1967, exactly when Charles Manson arrived in Haight-Ashbury, and right before the famed Summer of Love of 1967 in Haight-Ashbury.
You larger, and one pill makes you small.
It's also more than a bit interesting that the rise of the LSD culture, the Summer of Love, and all the craziness in Haight-Ashbury coincided exactly with the founding of this clinic. And be sure to keep this fact in mind. This medical clinic was launched with a grant from the National Institute for Mental Health, which also funded MKUltra. And there was an enormous surge in violence in the Haight-Ashbury area during this period, including rapes, robberies, assaults, and 8 murders. And the Zodiac Killer was linked to 5 murders in the San Francisco area in the late 1960s, so right during this period.
I shall wipe out a school bus some morning, shoot out the tires, and then pick off the kiddies as they come bounding out. That was the threat of the Zodiac Killer. Now, every day, police cars follow the buses which would be likely targets.
That area had never seen that level of murder and mayhem before. Back to David E. Smith. And I'll quote from David E. Smith on his background. Quote, I went to UC Berkeley from 1958 to 1960. Then I went to the University of San Francisco Medical School from 1960 to 1964. While I was in medical school, I was also in graduate school in pharmacology, studying psychopharmacology, the study of the effects of drugs on the mind, and when I started doing LSD research and also working with methamphetamines, end quote. So keep these facts in your head. Roger Smith was a former federal parole officer. He became a San Francisco parole officer so he could pursue his PhD at Berkeley in criminology with a focus on psychiatry. The only parolee he oversaw as a parole officer was Charles Manson, when usually parole officers have like 100 parolees to monitor, or maybe 200 parolees to monitor, depending on how intensive the case is. The only parolee he oversaw as a parole officer was Charles Manson. So Roger Smith, the parole officer, spent most of his time working at the Free Health Clinic in Haight-Ashbury, founded by Dr. David Smith. David Smith being a medical doctor who specializes in psychopharmacology, the study of the effects of drugs on the mind, with an emphasis on LSD and its interactions with methamphetamines, which is exactly what the CIA's MKUltra program was working on. So David E. Smith was joined at the clinic by Charles Manson's parole officer, Roger Smith, who was working on his PhD at Berkeley in almost exactly the same field. And Roger Smith, the parole officer, only had one parolee to monitor, Charles Manson. And Roger Smith's work at the clinic was being funded by the National Institute for Mental Health, which funded the CIA's illegal MKUltra program. So the San Francisco project, which Roger Smith was part of, was also funded by the National Institute for Mental Health. And one of Roger Smith's specific projects at the clinic was also funded by the National Institute for Mental Health, his project called the Amphetamine Research Project, which was to study the effects of amphetamines on the human brain. So this was also funded by the National Institute for Mental Health, through which funding for MKUltra also flowed. Now, amphetamines produce violence and often superhuman strength. A focus of research for the two Smiths was to see if the violence produced by the amphetamines could be controlled with LSD. LSD tends to make people more prone to the power of suggestion, which is why LSD trips are best conducted in group settings with a leader, so that everyone can have a similar experience, a similar trip. The interaction of the group tends to reinforce the LSD trip. And one purpose of the MKUltra program was to create human weapons, like in the Manchurian Candidate. But for a weapon to be useful, it has to be controllable. And Charles Manson and his core group of female followers were a constant presence at this clinic. Now, why would this lifelong criminal with Charles Manson's past, his history of just not following any rules, suddenly be showing up every day at a government-funded clinic? It just doesn't fit Manson's past pattern at all. Manson never stayed in one place. He was always skipping out on parole, moving out of the jurisdiction. He wasn't showing up every day at a government facility. And these girls who were also showing up at the clinic, these future killers, also had no history of violence and were from middle-class families. Okay, got it? Also noteworthy, very interesting here, is that Dr. David E. Smith conducted a 2-year research project on the effect of LSD and amphetamines on mice. Well, he found that when he injected the mice with amphetamines, the mice would transform from docile, peaceful creatures to ultra-violent combatants. And the violence and rage of the mice on amphetamines was unremitting. They tore each other apart, and their cages were drenched in blood and dismembered body parts. The mice on amphetamines would fight each other to the death, or until they were too exhausted to move. Also, the fighting would become more fierce the smaller and more confined the space. And in larger spaces, a dominant male figure would emerge. The weaker mice would try to stay out of the way of the dominant mouse, and the female mice would become subservient sex slaves. There would then be just nonstop sex, with the dominant male screwing every female mouse and sometimes the male mice. So this sounds exactly like the Manson family. Smith would then add LSD to the mix in an attempt to make the mice more controllable and open to the power of suggestion. And remember, susceptibility to the power of suggestion is one of the key features of LSD. Smith found that LSD produced a kind of dazed, disorganized behavior in the mice, but not violent behavior. And LSD was the preferred drug by Manson and his followers most of the time. They were dropping acid every day, all the time, acid being slang for LSD. And they did sometimes mix LSD with speed, but mostly they just used LSD. However, Linda Kasabian testified at trial that they all took speed on their way to the Tate and LaBianca murders. So soon after this clinic was founded, the 1967 Summer of Love commenced. Haight-Ashbury was suddenly awash in LSD and speed. Violence in Haight-Ashbury became rampant. Haight-Ashbury became a very dangerous place. And by the way, the files on Roger Smith's amphetamine research project completely vanished from the clinic soon after Manson and his family members were arrested for the Tate and LaBianca murders. Their story was that there was a burglary and the files went missing. Poof. And these files were the only items stolen. And both Smiths say they don't know what happened to the files. But here's the thing. If your research is being funded by the government, by the federal government, in this case the National Institute for Mental Health, you're supposed to keep files. You're supposed to keep records. But here's the clincher. Also connected with the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic was a renowned psychiatrist named Louis Jolyon West. He went by Jolly West. And who was Jolly West? Dr. Jolly was a leading figure in the CIA's MKUltra program. Jolly West was also a figure in the investigation into the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. believes that both President John F. Kennedy and his father, Bobby Kennedy, were killed by the CIA. And Bobby was going to be the Democrat nominee for president in 1968 until he was assassinated in June by Sirhan. And RFK Jr. compiles a mountain of evidence that both Kennedys, both JFK, President JFK, and Robert Kennedy were assassinated by the CIA. Perhaps I'll do another video on that at some point. But here's what connects the JFK assassination to Charlie Manson. Now, you remember Jack Ruby? Well, Jack Ruby shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald at a Dallas police station 2 days after Oswald shot and killed John F. Kennedy with a rifle from a 6-story window. Now, how Jack Ruby was allowed to have a free shot at Lee Harvey Oswald at a Dallas police station 2 days after the JFK assassination is more than a little bit mind-boggling. But here's where the Manson murders connect with the JFK assassination and the CIA's MKUltra program. Jack Ruby insisted he had no memory at all of killing Oswald. And Jolly West visited Jack Ruby alone in his jail cell as part of the investigation. And right after Jolly West's visit with Ruby, alone in his jail cell, Ruby reportedly went insane. Had a complete psychotic break, according to Jolly. And this happened right before Ruby was due to testify before the Warren Commission, which was investigating the JFK assassination. Then when Ruby did testify before the Warren Commission, Ruby appeared confused during his testimony, and he could not explain why he had killed Oswald. Jack Ruby then died of a heart attack on January 3rd, 1967. Dr. Jolly West was not just a figure in the MKUltra program, he was one of the top figures in MKUltra. And Jolly West was a key figure in the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. He was a constant presence at the clinic, and was almost certainly the real founder of the clinic. So let's get into a few more details on Dr. Jolly West. Jolly West completed his residency in psychiatry at Cornell University, which was an MKUltra institution. Dr. Jolly West became a subcontractor for MKUltra while he was chairman of the psychiatry department at the University of Oklahoma. He authored a paper titled Psychophysiological Studies of Hypnosis and Suggestibility, and a document titled Studies of Dissociative States. So Dr. Jolly West was one of the lead psychiatrists in the CIA's MKUltra program in the 1960s. We know this. You can just look it up in Wikipedia, or you can read the Senate committee hearings on this led by Senator Frank Church. From 1969 to 1989, Jolly West was the chairman of the psychiatry department at UCLA's School of Medicine and the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. But here's what launched Jolly West with MKUltra. Jolly West was an officer in the United States Air Force Medical Service from 1948 to 1956 during the Korean War. One of his assignments was to study returning American POWs from the Korean War who had been captured and sent to communist China for brainwashing, just like in the Manchurian Candidate. And these American POWs were forced to confess to war crimes and to accuse the United States of war crimes.
At the end of the Korean War, a number of freed American POWs came home seemingly brainwashed and espousing communist propaganda. American officials suspected that the soldiers had been subjected to what they thought were new communist mind control techniques. Alarmed by the situation, the newly formed CIA allocated $25 million for psychiatric experiments on human beings.
It was the most secret program ever conducted by the CIA in the United States. Patients at psychiatric hospitals, prisoners in federal institutions, and even people in the public were given drugs without their awareness or consent and experimented upon.
With the Nuremberg trial barely over, the American Secret Service begins Operation Paperclip. Nearly 1,500 German scientists, including war criminals, are expatriated to America. They are offered a new life in exchange for their knowledge and cooperation.
We're putting the Nazis on trial, but in fact, behind the curtain, we're doing some very nasty things ourselves to basically incarcerated people, poor people, individuals who at the time were called feeble-minded and locked up in institutions. And if you were in one of those institutions, whether you were indigent or an unwed mother or had some sort of mental incapacity, there's a good chance that you may have been incorporated in some sort of medical study where you would have been used and abused.
Assisted by the German scientists, the Americans begin pursuing their goal of the ultimate weapon, and everything is allowed in the name of the Cold War. The CIA was above all interested in psychological manipulation. Their goal was to create an infallible truth serum, wipe memories, turn humans into robots, and program them to kill. Conveniently, in 1948, a researcher in the Sandoz laboratories, Albert Hofmann, discovers a molecule that ignites the Secret Service, lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. It was believed that the hallucinogenic properties of this drug were key to psychological manipulation. Fearing that the Russians would get their hands on Sandoz's samples, the Americans bought all of their stock. The discovery of LSD was a godsend for the Army, who on the brink of nuclear weapons were looking for a weapon that could defeat an enemy without firing any weapons.
Jolly West became an expert and pioneer in the deprogramming of POWs returning from the Korean War. And West published a paper titled United States Air Force Prisoners of the Chinese Communists, Methods of Forceful Indoctrination, Observations, and Interviews. This brought West to the attention of the CIA. Dr. Jolly West then became a leading figure, a lead psychiatrist in the CIA's illegal MKUltra program, one of the purposes of which was to turn humans into controllable weapons, similar to what we saw in the 1962 movie, The Manchurian Candidate. Key features of this program were to identify drugs and mind control techniques that could be used to produce confessions, break down a subject's worldview, implant false memories, and create entirely new realities. On its human subjects, the program used high doses of psychoactive drugs, especially LSD, and other chemicals, including methamphetamines, often without the consent or knowledge of subjects. Also used was sleep deprivation, electroshock, hypnosis, solitary confinement, verbal and even sexual abuse, and other forms of torture. MKUltra's scope was broad, with activities carried out under the guise of research, under the guise of medical research, at more than 80 institutions aside from the military, including colleges, universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. And the CIA operated using front organizations such as the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. And Jolly West, Dr. Jolly West, was a constant presence at the Haight-Ashbury Clinic when Charles Manson and his girls were going there in 1967 and 1968. We also know that Jolly West arrived in Haight-Ashbury in 1966. He was taking a one-year sabbatical from the University of Oklahoma, nominally to pursue a fellowship at Stanford University. But Stanford has no record of Jolly's participation there. At the time of his arrival in Haight-Ashbury in 1966, few people even knew what LSD was. Suddenly, LSD was everywhere in Haight-Ashbury. And Dr. Jolly West, in one of his papers, had actually predicted the rise of violent LSD cults. How did he know so much about LSD and how LSD interacted with methamphetamines? Well, because he had been experimenting on humans with these drugs for years, sometimes with their consent, sometimes without their consent. In the case of the Unabomber, I guess they had his consent, even though he's only 17 years old when he started with MKUltra, the Unabomber. So now Dr. Jolly was going to introduce LSD and amphetamines into a population of hippies and social castaways that few cared about. And then he'd just see what happens. And it was actually Dr. Jolly West who arranged for the use of a crumbling Victorian house that would become the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic on Frederick Street. And let's not forget, Charles Manson and his key female followers would be living in a house just 2 blocks away. Dr. Jolly and David E. Smith designed the interior of the clinic to look like a hippie crash pad, with sofas and psychedelic art on the walls, peace symbols all over the place. And the employees of the clinic were supposed to dress like hippies. Jolly West installed 6 graduate students at the clinic. Their job was to lure in patients. Yeah, it's free medical care for the hippies and vagrants, right? Well, except it wasn't quite free, was it? In exchange, you got to be a human guinea pig for Jolly West's MKUltra mind control experiments, argues Tom O'Neill in his book, meticulously documented. And given what we know now about the CIA's MKUltra mind control experiments, such as on Ted Kaczynski, which created the Unabomber, this kind of puts the JFK and RFK assassinations in a completely new light. Doesn't Lee Harvey Oswald look exactly like the kind of human weapon created by the CIA's MKUltra program? And then Jack Ruby manages to get a clear shot at Oswald at that Dallas police station 2 days after the assassination. Then Ruby has no memory of shooting Oswald. Another curiosity about Charlie Manson's 14-month period in Haight-Ashbury before he moved to LA was the apparent immunity from the law he enjoyed. Even though he was on parole, he continued to break the law and get arrested. And yet he would quickly be out on the street. No jail time. O'Neill's book goes through dozens of examples of this. On April 23, 1968, the Los Angeles Times published an article headlined, "Wayward Bus Stuck in Ditch. Deputy finds nude hippies asleep in weeds." At first, the deputy thought they were dead. There were 9 women and 5 men, including Charlie Manson. This was the first time the Manson family came to public notice at all, in a little article in the LA Times. The article presented the scene as kind of amusing. And at that point, they just looked like a bunch of pretty harmless, stoned hippies. The article reports that Manson was booked on suspicion of grand theft. They were also stoned out of their minds. And as the group was being loaded into the police van, one of the Manson women said, "Wait, my baby's still on the bus." And the police went in the bus and found a sick baby boy covered in grime and sores all over his body. And the baby was just 1 week old. And even though Manson was in violation of his parole from this incident alone, he spent just 1 night in jail and then was released, along with the rest of the group. Now, Susan Atkins was actually held for 2 weeks because there were several warrants out for her arrest due to her parole violations. Like Manson, Susan Atkins was not much of a rule follower. She rarely showed up at her mandatory meetings with her parole officer, but she pretty much had immunity from the law, too. And 2 months before the Tate LaBianca murders, LA police pulled over a 68 Plymouth for speeding at 3:30 a.m. It was Charles Manson with 4 passengers, including Susan Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, and 2 others. Manson and his crew were arrested for driving under the influence, and the arresting officers saw that Manson was on federal parole. Atkins, of course, was also in violation of her parole, with arrest warrants out for her, but all were released with no charges. And local authorities were stunned that they could be released. They were just let back out on the street. And Manson was constantly being arrested for doing all kinds of things. He was arrested for vandalizing Death Valley National Park, for stealing cars, for possessing drug paraphernalia, and of course, parole violations. But he'd always be back out on the street within 24 hours. Normally, just simple parole violations like not showing up to your meeting with your parole officer will land you back in jail for an extended period, and especially if accompanied by additional crimes. But with Roger Smith overseeing Manson, there was almost nothing Manson could do short of murder that would land Manson back in jail for any extended period of time. And actually, Roger Smith was not even Manson's parole officer after Manson and his crew moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles in the spring of 1968, LA being outside Roger Smith's jurisdiction. He was a parole officer for San Francisco County. Now, why Manson was allowed to move to another jurisdiction while under parole is yet another mystery. But Manson and his crew remained protected by LA County. And Roger Smith was making regular trips from San Francisco to LA to see Manson, even though he had no formal jurisdiction anymore over Manson. Roger Smith was Manson's guardian angel from the law. He also weighed in on behalf of Manson family members who got in trouble. And quite interestingly, Manson liked to call Roger Smith Jabal, after one of the main characters in Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. Manson was fanatical about that book. Manson saw himself as like the hero of that novel, Valentine Michael Smith. And Valentine Michael Smith's spiritual protector, lawyer, and guardian angel in that novel is Jubal Harshaw. So Manson would call Roger Smith Jubal, because with Roger Smith protecting Manson and his crew, they effectively had immunity from the law. Valentine Michael Smith also started a religious cult called the Church of All Worlds, replete with sex orgies and drug use that resembled the Charlie Manson cult. Manson also knew how to hypnotize people. During Manson's time in Los Angeles County Jail in the 1960s, Manson met up with the actor Danny Trejo, a famous actor. Wasn't famous at that time, but he would become famous. And Manson would practice hypnotism on Trejo and the other inmates. Trejo says Manson hypnotized Trejo and the other inmates to make them feel like they were smoking weed or high on heroin. And Trejo said it worked. Manson was a completely unknown figure at that point. So let's hear Trejo on this.
So you met Charles Manson in prison, didn't you? What was that story? Can you tell us that?
County jail. In the county jail. But let me tell you, Charlie wasn't the guy that you saw on the TV specials. All right. He was he was like 5'4", 5'5", little scrawny. We found out that he could hypnotize you.
So you're saying that he got you guys loaded up on heroin or weed, but there was no heroin or weed in the room, right? He was doing this purely through hypnosis.
People know when I get loaded on heroin, my eyes, I get red under my eyes. And it's like literally the first thing, blah, you throw up, you dump. And I mean, me and Chato, it's like we both got blah. He dumped in the sink, I dumped in the toilet, and looked. Hey, what you doing? And oh, everybody was like shocked. Johnny Ronnie Cruz, he was like, "Well, what happened? He never got loaded." I was sorry when they transferred Charlie out.
You've basically got unlimited access to anything that you want because he can just keep on hypnotizing you back into it. What was he in for? Do you know why he was there?
Yeah, I have no idea. He was nothing of any, because he was a petty thief. He wasn't. Charlie couldn't have done that any place, any time, but right there. And my friend George Perry knew him in Frisco, knew him in Oakland. Okay, and he was a scrawny little hippie, and the girls that he got, Linda Kasabian, all of them were broken. All of them, they were up in Oakland and San Francisco being ripped off by the pimps and raped by the pimps. And so he came around with a big bus and some acid and said, let me lead you. So it was kind of like, they looked at him like, yeah, he's the Messiah,
So what do you think? Do you think Charles Manson was an MKUltra experiment gone wrong? Well, I think that actually, maybe, Charles Manson performed exactly as designed. That it wasn't a mistake by the CIA. Because Charlie Manson effectively ended the 1960s and all the craziness with his murders. Manson and his family became the personification of the 1960s gone wrong, just gone out of control. After the Manson murder spree, there were no more Woodstocks, no more Summers of Love, not much of an anti-war movement anymore, or at least it was greatly diminished. By 1971, it was really no longer cool to be a hippie. Richard Nixon won 49 states in 1972, with 60% of the popular vote won by 20 points, largely due to the public's rejection of the campus riots and mayhem of the 1960s and early 1970s, symbolized by Charles Manson and his hippie followers, symbolized by Helter, Skelter. America said no to all that. And it's worth noting that the CIA and FBI launched major PSYOP programs in the 1960s aimed at discrediting the anti-Vietnam War movement. Now, the CIA and FBI back in those days was anti-communist and basically conservative. Back in those days, I kind of liked the CIA. I assumed that they were good. I didn't know about all this MKUltra stuff. The CIA's program to discredit the anti-war movement was called Operation Chaos. And the FBI's version of the program was called CONINTELPRO, for Counterintelligence Program. And these programs aim to, quote, discredit, disrupt, and neutralize targeted groups by spreading misinformation, provoking internal conflicts, and damaging their public image. They would also use the legal process to harass their targets. And what better way to discredit the anti-war movement than to create a Charles Manson? And what better way to do this than to lace the anti-war movement with free LSD and speed to create all kinds of mayhem that the public would reject? Handing Nixon 49 states in 1972. And of course, there's a reason that the CIA called this program Operation Chaos. Charlie called it Helter Skelter. Means the same thing. The CIA wanted to create chaos, wanted to create Helter Skelter that the public would reject at the ballot box, which is exactly what happened. And Dr. Jolly West, Roger Smith, and David Smith all dressed as hippies during Manson's Haight-Ashbury period. And this was pretty funny because Jolly West and Roger Smith were rock-ribbed Republicans. You couldn't get more conservative than these guys. Take a look at them. Do they look like Haight-Ashbury types to you? Yet there they were at the clinic looking like hippies to blend in with the scene. Yet nothing about Charlie's period in Haight-Ashbury, nothing about the clinic made it into the Charlie Manson trial, even though Haight-Ashbury was where Charlie formed his family of about 24 followers. To keep its narrative coherent, the prosecution could not allow in the Haight-Ashbury material, the prosecution being led by LA District Attorney Vince Bugliosi. The prosecution had to focus on Charlie's activities in LA and the Spahn Ranch, which was 25 miles northwest of LA, after he moved to LA from Haight-Ashbury. The prosecution couldn't let the Haight-Ashbury material in, the material about the clinic, all the time that Charlie was spending there, because that would mean that a strong case could be made that the CIA was actually responsible for these murders. Now, the MKUltra program was not yet known to the public, but the last thing the CIA would want is for the MKUltra program to be exposed by the Manson trial. So the government had to keep the focus on Manson's activities in Los Angeles, had to pretend he was never in Haight-Ashbury, had to completely ignore Manson's near daily presence at the free medical clinic and the key figures there, the two Smiths and Dr. Jolly West. Who are these guys? We'd have to bring them in to testify. We'd have to depose them if Manson had had a good defense, and if the defense became suspicious of that clinic in Haight-Ashbury. And obviously, if a good legal team knew about that clinic and knew that Manson was there almost every day with his followers, his legal defense team would want to know what was going on at that clinic. Why was he there all the time? But Charlie had no legal defense to speak of. Initially, he had a public defender, a guy named Ronald Hughes, who was a hippie lawyer, wasn't a real lawyer, he'd never tried a murder case, never tried a serious crime before. Then he was swapped out 2 weeks before the trial for a complete joke of a lawyer, a guy named Irving Kanarek. And Kanarek was jailed twice during the trial for contempt of court. And he was making constant objections that didn't really make sense, which annoyed the jury. He was just objecting all the time. No problem with objecting all the time, but the objections need to make sense. And then, of course, Charlie famously insisted on defending himself with extended courtroom speeches. The speeches were famous and compelling, but didn't help his defense one bit. And there were constant irregularities during the trial, such as the judge in constant private meetings with the prosecution, without the defense lawyer present. That's never supposed to happen. I've never seen it happen. And the many problems with the trial and Bugliosi's case are well covered in Tom O'Neill's book. But one pretty obvious point, if Bugliosi's Helter Skelter thesis was correct, and the murders were part of Manson's plan to start a worldwide race war, or at least a national race war, why were there only 2 sets of murders? Why didn't Manson's home invasion murders just continue? 2 full months passed between the Tate LaBianca murders and the arrest of Charlie Manson and his followers. So there's plenty more time to commit many more home invasion style murders to get the Helter Skelter race war really moving. But there was nothing after that. Now, this certainly doesn't mean that Charlie Manson and his family weren't very dangerous people, but the prosecution's theory makes very little sense. And one of the really interesting parts of the Charlie Manson saga is his relationship with Dennis Wilson, the drummer for the Beach Boys, and the brother of Beach Boy lead Brian Wilson. Carl Wilson, the other brother, played guitar. Dennis Wilson met Charlie in the spring of 1968 after Dennis Wilson picked up 2 hitchhikers on Sunset Strip, who were actually members of the Manson family, Ella Jo Bailey and Patricia Krenwinkel. And Dennis Wilson brought them home to his mansion in Pacific Palisades. And the girls told Wilson about their spiritual guru, Charlie. Wilson left the house for a bit, and when he returned, Manson was in the driveway. The two hit it off. Charlie taught Dennis Wilson how to play guitar. The girls took Wilson's Rolls Royce and went dumpster diving and came back with food. Then the Manson family moved into Wilson's house, which was probably fun for a while. There were nonstop orgies, new dinner parties, drugs. Wilson was so captivated by Charlie Manson that he wanted the Beach Boys to join the Manson cult. Fortunately, his bandmates rejected the idea.
Dennis Wilson was the embodiment of what the Beach Boys were about. Their first songs were about surfing and cars.
Manson's sermons denouncing material possessions and celebrating communal and spiritual unity, along with the sexual allure of the girls, won him over immediately.
My first exposure to the wizard, as Dennis would call him, was he called me up one night and, "Greg, you have to come down here, man. You got to see this guy. He's the wizard, and he's got all these girls." I must say this, when Charlie was around, everybody knew it. He had an energy that you couldn't not pay attention to Charlie. Don't forget, Dennis had left his house and his family and his wife and stuff, and now he had all this literally adoration And he had all these girls. They were making him clothes, and they almost would bow down to him. So I'm sure, for the moment, he was very charmed by the whole scene.
Wilson was also fascinated by Manson's music. Impressed by Manson's musical talents, Wilson hoped to both learn from and collaborate with his new house guest.
And Dennis Wilson was covering all costs for the Manson family, including food and transportation. Wilson allowed Manson and his girls to use his fancy cars and his credit cards. And in return, Manson provided Dennis Wilson all the women he could handle. So Dennis was happy, for a while. The problem was Manson's people would destroy Wilson's cars and stole most of his belongings. It just got to be too much. But Manson and his crew would not move out. It was getting pretty scary at Dennis Wilson's house. So Dennis Wilson moved out. Manson and his crew lived at Dennis Wilson's house for the entire summer of 1968 before moving to the Spahn Ranch, which was a 55-acre ranch that had been used to film Hollywood westerns, but that had fallen into disrepair. The owner of the ranch was George Spahn. He allowed Manson and his family to live there for free in exchange for helping Spahn keep up the ranch, including the horse rental business, which was the ranch's main source of income at the time. And no doubt George got plenty of sex from the women as well. I mean, imagine showing up to the ranch to rent a horse and being greeted by Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, and perhaps Charlie himself. The Beach Boys actually bought a song from Charlie Manson called Cease to Exist. Manson was also given a motorcycle as part of the deal. The Beach Boys kept much of the music, adding piano, guitar, bass, drums, organ, and sleigh bells, also changed the name of the song to Never Learn Not to Love, and completely rewrote the lyrics. And this incensed Manson, definitely, but not enough to trigger Manson and his family's murderous rampages, as was the narrative of the prosecution. Also, the Beach Boys did not give credit to Manson on the album for his song, apparently as retribution for Manson and his crew stealing Dennis Wilson's stuff. But this, not getting credit for the song, didn't seem to bother Manson as much as the rewriting of his lyrics. And here's Manson's original song.
Cease to exist. Just come and say you love me. Give up your world. Come on, you can't be. I'm your kind, oh, your kind, and I can see. Walk on, walk on. I love you, pretty girl. My life is yours. Yeah, you can have my world. Never had a lesson I ever learned, but I know we all get our turn. I love you. Never learn not to love you.
I think that the collaboration between Dennis and Manson really showed potential with this Never Learn Not to Live song. I think it definitely works. I think it's a win for the Beach Boys. And I think an album full of that kind of sound would have been amazing for them at the time.
And here's yet another problem with the prosecution's theory of the case. The prosecution's narrative is that the Beach Boys' record producer, Terry Melcher, promised Manson a record deal, which never came through. This, according to the prosecution, triggered Manson. But O'Neill's book, Chaos, documents that Melcher maintained a friendly relationship with Manson, continued to hang out with Manson and the family at the Spahn Ranch. Melcher loved it out there, endless orgies and drugs. And in fact, Vincent Bugliosi's own notes, the LA district attorney, his own notes say that Terry Melcher visited the Manson family at the Spahn Ranch 3 times during a 60-day period after the Tate and LaBianca murders, but before, obviously, Manson was arrested. So Melcher hung out at the Spahn Ranch at least 3 times after the murders, was having a great time out there, loved it. But that fact was omitted from the trial. That fact was not given to the defense, or at least the defense never saw this information. Of course, Charlie's defense lawyer was so woefully incompetent, so might have missed this information even if it was turned over to him as is required in criminal cases. But Melcher, Terry Melcher, the record producer for the Beach Boys, testified at trial that he only met Manson on 3 occasions, and that he made only 1 trip to the Spahn Ranch to check out Manson's music. Melcher testified that he was unimpressed with Manson's music, and that was it. Said he never saw Manson again. So Terry Melcher perjured himself according to the Tom O'Neill book, apparently under pressure from the prosecution to maintain the narrative, perhaps in exchange for avoiding criminal charges for drug offenses or who knows what else. And of course, Terry Melcher had a strong self-interest in distancing himself from Manson after the murders. So of course he's going to say he barely knew Manson. Nope, Terry Melcher was a regular presence at the Spahn Ranch even after the murders.
Dennis was off to a non-disclosed area. Nobody knew really where he was.
Dennis's whole personality changed. He wasn't at all the same person. There was a paranoia about him, the fear of how close he was to it all.
Dennis was not going to cooperate with Bugliosi, and neither was Terry. I, to this day, believe Terry made a deal with Bugliosi. What it was, I don't know.
Having placed such faith in the man he called the Wizard, after the shocking news of the murders emerged, Dennis Wilson was cast adrift. The once vital soul of the Beach Boys was left haunted by a friendship he could never erase, and over time he lost himself in drink and drugs. He died in 1983, aged only 39, and had refused since Manson's arrest to ever discuss the affair in public.
O'Neill reports that Manson was disappointed that nothing happened with the record deal, but was not in a rage about it. That narrative was a creation of the prosecution, according to O'Neill. Manson and his cult were quite happy to have a free place to live on a 55-acre ranch. Life was great for them, and O'Neill's book effectively dismantles the prosecution's narrative in the case, dismantles the prosecution's theory for the motive behind the murders. And once you dismantle the prosecution's motives, the motives for the murders, the question then is, why did this happen? Sure, Manson was a career criminal, but low-level stuff. Car theft, burglary, drug possession, pimping, trying to pass a bogus $43 check that got him 7 years in federal prison. Stuff like that. Nothing that comes remotely close to the Tate LaBianca savage mass killings. That was completely new for Manson. Completely new for just about anybody in history. So the question is, why the sudden and total change? Manson changed and changed dramatically during his time in Haight-Ashbury. So why am I so interested in Charles Manson? And why is this subject relevant now? Well, I always wondered how Charlie, who grew up without parents, who raised himself, who never attended school, who had spent more than half of his life in prison by age 32, could have attracted this following of intelligent young people from good families, from middle-class backgrounds, from good schools, and somehow turn these intelligent people into zombies who would kill on command, who would do absolutely anything he told them to do. How is that possible? Well, it's possible if they were products of MKUltra, which of course also produced the Unabomber. Turned a Harvard math student with 167 IQ, who had a very promising future, into one of the most dangerous domestic terrorists in America's history.
Sit down, sit down.
Close the bathroom door.
You can't sing. For always is always forever. One is one is one. Disguise yourself for your father. All is none, all is none, none is one.
I started seeing the CIA as a malevolent force in 2016, when the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the FBI colluded with the Hillary Clinton campaign to manufacture the Russia collusion hoax against Donald Trump. They invented a narrative that Donald Trump and his campaign colluded with Russia, colluded with Putin to steal the 2016 election. The CIA tried to frame Donald Trump as a traitor, as an asset of Vladimir Putin. The Russia collusion hoax was, of course, proven false by a 2-year independent counsel investigation, the Mueller investigation. Even though the 2-year Mueller investigation was staffed with 19 Democrat prosecutors and spent $30 million, they couldn't come up with anything on Donald Trump, not so much as an unpaid parking ticket. There were then 2 subsequent investigations that proved that the FBI knew the Russia collusion hoax was a hoax from the start, but pursued their investigation anyway for 2 years, hoping to find something else that Donald Trump might have done wrong. Some process crime or something like that, maybe filled out his taxes wrong or checked off a wrong box or something. Barack Obama's FBI director, James Comey, managed to trigger this 2-year independent counsel investigation, the Mueller investigation, on his way out the door during the transition in December of 2016. That's what opened my eyes to the fact that the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA, the National Security Agency, are deeply corrupt, highly politicized organizations. The CIA and FBI are not primarily focused on protecting us. Their primary focus is to control the American people. Elections have become almost a fiction in America. What the CIA sets out to do is manipulate public opinion. And one of its tools for doing this is Google. Google was launched with startup capital from the CIA and the NSA. And the Senator Church Committee hearings that produced the historic report in 1973 that exposed MKUltra also exposed Operation Mockingbird. The Church Committee found that the CIA was planting assets in America's major news organizations, at the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, NBC, CBS, to manipulate the news. Now, back then, in Manson's day and during the Vietnam War, we only had 3 major TV networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, plus PBS. And back then, the CIA wanted to rally public support for the Vietnam War. Back then, the CIA was anti-communist. So the CIA was targeting the anti-war movement. And I believe one of its weapons for doing this was its creation of Charles Manson and his crew, his family of followers. Was Charles Manson an MKUltra experiment gone wrong? Or did Charles Manson perform exactly as designed? I'm also persuaded that the CIA engineered the assassination of both John F. Kennedy in 1963 and his brother Bobby Kennedy in 1968. Oswald, a former U.S. Marine, looked exactly like the kind of human weapon the CIA was trying to create with MKUltra, as does Oswald's killer, Jack Ruby, who insisted he had no memory of shooting Oswald at that Dallas police station. Again, how was Jack Ruby allowed to have a clear shot at Oswald when Oswald was in police custody 2 days after he killed the President of the United States? And of course, we still have not seen the CIA's files on the JFK assassination 61 years later. What we have is the Warren Commission report, which was an obvious whitewashing, an investigation conducted by the very same people who need to be investigated. We know the CIA hated JFK and RFK, and JFK hated the CIA. John F. Kennedy blamed the CIA for the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which the CIA was in charge of. The Bay of Pigs, of course, was a failed invasion of Cuba in April of 1961, led by the CIA in an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime. The CIA had trained 1,500 Cuban exiles for the invasion. The CIA also supplied 8 B-26 bombers to bomb Castro's airfields. No U.S. troops were used. This was a 100% CIA operation. And Castro easily defeated the invasion within 3 days. In these U.S.-trained paramilitaries, these Cuban exiles were rounded up and either shot or imprisoned by Castro. This was an enormous embarrassment for President Kennedy, who had only been president for 3 months. Made JFK look incompetent. Castro became a national hero for defeating the invasion, which solidified Castro's power. And JFK blamed the CIA for this fiasco. As a result, John F. Kennedy became highly skeptical of expanding U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, which further put him at odds with the CIA. The CIA and the military-industrial complex are always pro-war. The more wars, the better for the CIA and the U.S. military-industrial complex. If there are no wars, the CIA has to invent wars. The CIA misled President George W. Bush about Saddam Hussein having a nuclear weapons program, which got the Iraq War launched in March of 2003. Turned out Iraq had no nuclear weapons program, as we were told, no weapons of mass destruction. The result was 3,000 Americans dead, 60,000 wounded, 500,000 to 1 million Iraqis dead, $3 trillion spent. That was the result of being misled by the CIA. And JFK's Attorney General, his brother Bobby, had opened up an investigation into the CIA because the CIA had misled John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, on the Bay of Pigs fiasco and screwed up the operation to overthrow Fidel Castro. So JFK and the CIA were enemies at that point. The CIA had a strong incentive to get rid of JFK and replace him with a pro-Vietnam War Lyndon Johnson. And the CIA had a strong incentive to get rid of Bobby Kennedy, who would have won the Democrat nomination for president in 1968. He was promising to end the Vietnam War, and he had already opened up an investigation of the CIA when he was his brother's Attorney General. The CIA certainly did not want Robert Kennedy to be president. Enter Robert Kennedy's assassin, Sirhan Sirhan, on June 6, 1968. Sirhan Sirhan also had all the hallmarks of being a product of MKUltra. Now, the propaganda narrative that we've been fed is that Sirhan killed Bobby Kennedy because Bobby was pro-Israel. Every politician, every U.S. politician was pro-Israel, equally pro-Israel back in those days. So that theory makes no sense. Nor did Sirhan have any history of radicalism. Sirhan was not even a Muslim. He was a Jordanian Christian. He attended John Muir High School in Pasadena, California, and Pasadena City College. He was from a nice Jordanian middle-class immigrant family. No background of political radicalism whatsoever. So he sure looks like a product of MKUltra to me. Of course, this is just speculation on my part, but nothing about Sirhan being Bobby Kennedy's assassin makes sense other than that. Like the Unabomber, I believe Sirhan, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Jack Ruby were all products of MKUltra. Just speculation on my part. What do you think? I'll read your thoughts in the comments below. Now, RFK Jr., he believes that the CIA killed both JFK and his father, Robert Kennedy. RFK Jr. visited Sirhan in prison in 2018 and conducted a long interview with Sirhan. And given what we know now about the CIA and how the CIA will stop at nothing to get the political result it wants, no theory is out of bounds. Today's Democrat Party has become the party of corporate America, the military-industrial complex, and Big Pharma. We saw that during the pandemic. The CIA, the FBI, today's Democrat Party, and the propaganda media are all part of the same cabal. They're all on the same team. They're just playing different roles with the same mission. That mission being control of the people. CNN literally employs Obama's former CIA director, John Brennan, and Obama's National Security Agency director, James Clapper, as expert commentators to make sure the American people understand the talking points. So the propaganda media doesn't even hide the fact anymore that it repeats whatever happened to be the CIA's talking points for that day, which are indistinguishable from the Democrat Party's talking points. And they see their mission as to defeat Donald Trump by any means possible, including multiple assassination attempts. They see Donald Trump as a threat to their world order. He does things like question NATO, and why the U.S. taxpayers have to fund the bulk of NATO when it's Europe that gets most of the benefit of NATO. The United States doesn't really need NATO, quite frankly. And why does the United States need 800 military bases around the world when China, supposedly our number one adversary, only has one military base outside of China? And why does the United States need to spend more on its military than the rest of the world combined on military? And then Donald Trump said, maybe 18 years of war in Afghanistan is enough. And notice that there were no new wars under Trump. In fact, there were very few wars at all under Trump. The world was in a state of relative peace and calm during Donald Trump's first term as president. That's bad for the CIA. That's bad for the trillion-dollar-a-year military-industrial complex. That's bad for business. The Russia collusion hoax was a complete fiction and fell apart, but it did trigger a 2-year independent counsel investigation. Then we had 2 impeachment hoaxes. Then we had the January 6th setup and frame-up, which I cover in this video here. Then when all that didn't work, the Harris-Biden regime and Democrat prosecutors launched relentless lawfare against Donald Trump after he announced that he would be running for the presidency in 2024. The political prosecutions and lawfare against Donald Trump did not work. So then we had 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump this past summer by 2 losers who fit the profile of MKUltra's mind control experiments. MKUltra was disbanded in 1973, but I'm sure it still exists under another name. And again, it's really not so much that the CIA is left or right. The CIA advances the party that promotes the military-industrial complex that President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us about. Donald Trump threatens the CIA's regime, threatens the military-industrial complex, because Donald Trump opposes endless wars. Whether the CIA was more leaning right and anti-communist in the 1960s and 1970s, or more left today, the CIA and the FBI basically see the Constitution as the problem, as an obstacle to get around. And today's propaganda media and Democrat Party see the Constitution the same way. In a big article in the New York Times now tells us that the Constitution is the problem. The New York Times is blatantly, and today really openly, a propaganda organ of the CIA. What these institutions really want is for America to become a one-party, China-style authoritarian dictatorship. It's really not about capitalism versus socialism anymore. It's about control. It's about political power.
The people that govern you, the people that tell you people what to do, they're not good people.
Is there anything you think you can pass on that society really is missing and that you can tell them about?
Society knows when it wants to know that it's just a jellyfish and is only controlled by the people who want to move the sheep around. They'll tell them anything. Everybody knows that everybody's lying. Look at where your children are looking at it from. Who can they trust?
Here are a couple of books of mine that you might want to check out, both available on Amazon in all the formats. One is Bitcoin, A Beginner's Guide, Your Off-Ramp from the Corrupt Political System and Protection from Economic Collapse. And the other book is Win Life, Success Skills Schools Don't Teach. Here's Manson at his parole hearing in 1992, explaining his ongoing bad behavior in prison.
Began to call me a liar and a treacherous bitch. Inmate Manson also stated, I would like to break all the bones in your body, starting with your elbow, working down to your knees. Then inmate Manson stated, tell that man up there, the control booth operator, to open the cell door and let me beat you into submission so that you'll be under my power. Do you recall that?
Yeah.
Threatening staff?
Do I get to explain?
You want to explain that?
Yeah.
You got it. Go ahead.
Prison is a treacherous place to live in. You miss one move and you get stabbed. You got to be aware of everything that goes on. There's nothing that you can overlook. So out in the shower area, they got some rust that's coming out of the pipes. And this rust is building up and it looks just exactly like instant coffee. If you take a spoonful of that rust and you mix it in with instant coffee and you give somebody a cup of coffee, you can burn their kidneys out. You can kill them. So there's a deadly substance out in the yard that needs cleaned up. Because if I'm aware of this substance, when someone else comes out, they see this substance, they may pick some of it up and put it in my coffee. So I try to be aware of everything. So I asked the woman when she came to work, I said, would you take the hose that you've been watering me down with and squirting me with when no one's looking and go out there and squirt down that yard and clean up that mess out there to where, and she says, well, no, she wasn't going to do that. I said, well, somebody needs to do that because it's a danger, you know. So she says she didn't want to do it and she called me a liar, so I called her a liar back. Now, whether you want to accept this or not, the deer in the woods, there's a doe and there's a buck. The buck comes up to the doe and scares the doe, and the doe turns around and backs up to the buck. That's a matriarch and a patriarch. I live in a patriarch. You live in a matriarch. You back up to your women. I don't back up to my women. I don't take no lip from my women. I don't give them none, but I don't take none either. If they disrespect me, I'll disrespect them back.
More Manson here.
Do you miss women?
Certainly. My goodness, yeah, damn right.
What do you think of women?
Oh, I like them. Yeah, they're nice. They're put together well and everything, and they're soft and spongy. Yeah, they're nice. As long as they keep their mouth shut and do what they're supposed to do.
Why do you say that?
Because that's what a woman's supposed to do.
Keep her mouth shut and do what she's supposed to do?
Sure.
Right, somewhere out there, there's at least one son that we know of that's your child, who's probably about 25 or 26 years old. You talk to that kid. What are you going to say to him?
You got to catch it on your own, boy. Train's hard. The road's rough.
And that's it.
That's all I knew. That's all anyone ever told me.
All right.
How do you feel about the fact that you're going to spend the rest of your life here?
The rest of my life where?
Right here.
You guys are poor. You've been living 1,000 illusions, man. The rest of your life where?
In prison.
In prison. What prison? You got a prison in your mind? You see what I'm saying? You're in prison, son. You're the one that's in jail because you think there is such a thing as a prison. Did you have any thoughts about something? Was you wanting to go anywhere?
Were you happy when you found out you weren't going to go to the gas chamber, Charles?
I knew I wasn't going to go to the gas chamber because I hadn't done anything wrong.
You scared to die?
Sometimes I feel I'm scared to live. Living is what scares me. Dying is easy. How long have I been in jail? 34 years? 34 years, so...
Out of 47, you've been here 34.
I've been in jail, prison, a long time, all my life. I was raised up in here. So I understand jail. So I understand myself and I can deal with that. But there's different colors on different people's backs doing different things. It's a different world. I love the world I live in, too, just like Reagan loves the world he lives in.
See, spiritualism scares you people because you've got this little stereotype church that you're buying and selling, and you're trying to put God in a building. But God is much bigger than that little church. You know, and spiritualism is a lot more than they put in libraries and books, you know.
What do you miss most being in that cell?
I miss having my music because some egomaniac wants to feel important, and they keep my music away from me.
Your music is your guitar.
Yeah.
When we sit here and talk to you, people wonder, where did Charlie Manson come from? What are your earliest memories?
I come from the heart of Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra.
But what does that mean?
Tom Mix.
Those were the people that you listened to as a child?
Yeah, Roosevelt. I come from the hills of Kentucky. I come from hard times, bologna for Sunday dinner. I come from the Depression.
What about your mother?
Mother is the icebox.
Yeah.
She's the penitentiary. One of my first recollections is walking in Moundsville State Prison, West Virginia. Big gray stone place. And I come to visit my mom. She was doing time there.
For what?
Strong arm robbery. Trying to make some food, put some food on the table and give me an operation when I was a child.
That's your first, one of your earliest memories?
Yeah, I remember that. That was a...
Are there happy memories?
I don't have that.
You don't have that?
I don't have that yin and yang that you do.
Is that yin yang?
Yeah, in other words, you can't make me unhappy.
Are sad memories, though, growing up?
I don't have all that.
Yeah.
Who is the one? Yes, I'm looking for the last door. And if you are the one, friend, you don't need to look anymore. And if you are to my friend, say you know that there's no place left to go. A reckless kid, baby, we don't know. Except through the music. How else do you think I could stop the confusion that's in your minds? Come on, sing these songs as you come along to the music. Each unto his own kind. Now everybody knows that there's nothing to know. Everybody knows that there's no place left to go. When you try it's much better than slow, cause it's coming down quick, and you know. Don't go back, just go. Don't look back, just go. Just follow the music, just follow the sound. Just follow the music, just follow the sound. It's turning upside down. It's upside down. It's turning. It's upside down. It's turning. Yea, though you walk through the valley of death, I'll be beside you. From hide away. It's a near and the end, so come on in and I'll find you. From hide away. He rides like the wind. From hide away. With his hair long and flowing. From hide away. In a no crime, ain't no sin. Ride away. It is ours, always knowing. Ride away. The fear is all gone. Ride away. And the timeless winds are blowing. Ride away. His motor's running good. Ride away. And over the mountains he's going. Ride away. Get on, ride away. Get on, ride my way. The world is my playground, so come on, ride. Come on away, man. Like the wind, you do ride. Ride away. Put your past far behind you. Ride away. We'll find a place to hide. Ride away. Where the man won't find you. Ride away. Get on, ride away. Come on, ride my way. Get underneath the man with a gun. He knows that he ain't down for having no